as we put more heat into the atmosphere and the ocean and the surface of the land, that heat is what is the source of power for weather. All the extremes of weather to increase.
Hi everybody. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Stefan Sommer. We are going to talk to climate change and refugees. Welcome to my program, Dr. Sommer.
Enrique, thank you so much for having me on.
Perfect, great. I really appreciate your kindness to accept this invitation. I knew about you in an interview they gave you in your local radio station. I like the way you communicate. I have plenty of questions about climate change and refugees. Okay, before we start, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stefan Sommer is the Director of Education at the Merriam-Powell Center for Environment Research at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Sommer's doctoral work is in ecological sustainability, and he has studied effective communication across cultural boundaries in many contexts, including PBS film. Also, you are a board director member of Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. Is that right?
Yes, that's all right. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, a great background. And you know a lot of the subject we are going to cover in this conversation. Before we start about refugees, tell us why natural disasters are more frequently and intense in these years.
Well, that's one of the main outcomes of climate change is because we're putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they act like a blanket. So we're thickening that blanket that holds in the heat from the sun. As we put more heat into the atmosphere and the ocean and the surface of the land, that heat is what is the source of power for weather. And so we expect, as the climate continues to warm, we expect more frequent storms, stronger storms, more frequent droughts, longer and drier droughts. We expect all the extremes of weather to increase.
I see. Climate change will make some part of the world more vulnerable, more difficult to live. I assume that this provoke mass immigrations. This provoke people leaving their homes, houses, works, family, just for looking for new locations to live more prosper. How will impact in the future this massive move of people in the need for a place to survive?
Well, there are many ways to measure the impacts of climate change, and economic measures clearly show that the gross domestic product for many countries is declining now because of changes in agricultural productivity, first and foremost, but in many things. So people don't flee their homes easily. Most people like where they live. All their friends, their families are there. And so for them to pick up and leave their homes, it's a big, big decision. And they only do it if they are on the verge of starvation in many cases, or economic ruin in other cases. And so we'll talk about these two things today, and how it's affecting people. Last year alone, it's now 2021, I should say 2019,
yes,
alone, there were 23.9 million people that fled their homes because of climate disasters. and the number of people fleeing their homes because of climate disasters has been increasing steadily. The World Bank came out with a report in 2018 called Groundswell, in which they did a very careful study of how will climate change continue to affect people. And in that careful study, they decided that the most likely outcome from climate change will be that we have 143 million additional climate refugees by the year 2050.
Wow.
So this is huge,
Yes.
and it affects many parts of the world. For they made those projections for different areas on the globe, and for Latin America, they're projecting that there will be 17 million additional climate refugees as a result of. And if you look at the report in detail, what they're projecting is that water availability will decline because of changes in rainfall. And it's not just the changes in rainfall. So even if the rainfall stays steady, if the temperature rises, more of that water will evaporate. And so that means there's less water available for plants to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So based on all of that, they project that there will be less water availability for people and lower agricultural productivity, particularly in Mexico and in what's called the Northern Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And there's a dry corridor through those countries that has been hit by more extreme and more frequent drought. And many of the people in those countries are, it's not just the farmers, of course, it's also the people who work for the farmers.
Yes.
If the farmer's crop is no longer as productive, he can't hire as many helpers to do all the things that happen on the farm. And so, it's the people who work on the farms, it's the farmers themselves, and all of the other subsidiary occupations that are related to crop production. So people are being affected in pretty dramatic ways when they can't support their families anymore.
So basically,
they get desperate, and they come to the conclusion that there's no way for us to survive here. We need to leave, and that's a very difficult decision.
it is a difficult decision. It's a humanitarian problem. It's about moral issue also. Do refugees could ask for asylum when they arrive to another country? There is a legislation that allow immigration that allow asylum when they arrive to this country because they lost their homes, they lost family members sometimes. Is there a regulation about this?
Well, there should be a better approach to this.
Oh.
So in the World Bank study, they pointed out that if we follow the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations put out many decades ago, then the number of climate refugees will be less. And the 17 Sustainability Development Goals are about helping people to survive when they have hunger, helping people when they're suffering from poverty, and helping people retrain. In some cases, farmers need to switch to different crops, and that requires some retraining. Well, what crops will work in this new conditions? Or, training in all sorts of. So if we follow those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, then it would result in fewer people having to flee their homes.
Mm-hmm.
Once they flee, for a long time, the United States had policies to welcome immigrants. Our Statue of Liberty stands for taking in the people who are suffering in the world and helping them. But of course, in the last 4 years, the United States policies have been very unfriendly to people seeking asylum.
Yes.
And I think that in the next 4 years, these things will change. In fact, our new president has already issued some policy orders to change the way that we treat people arriving at our borders. many people in the United States have listened to uh, our past leadership say things like, well, these people arriving at our borders from Central America are members of gangs. They are bad people. They are, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Many of these farmers, first, before they flee to the United States, they flee to the cities, look for work. When there's not work, and the cities are, in some cases, controlled by gangs, and the work availability in some cases is controlled by gangs. They don't want to join the gangs, so they then have no further choice but to flee. And so really the people who arrive at the United States border are not gang members. They're desperate people who have been forced out by starvation, joblessness, and they're seeking asylum. And so we need to get back to the old policies in the United States of welcoming people who are in need. But also, we should recognize, just beyond that, that the United States has one of the largest carbon footprints on Earth.
So we are responsible for those droughts that they have in their countries. So we feel like, oh, we, the United States, we are not going to be affected for this climate issue. But remember, we also could have refugees in our own borders too, right? Some part of the United States basically will disappear, especially the coast when the sea level rise. Is that true?
Absolutely. So yes, we have a responsibility, as you said, because we are one of the main causers of climate change by adding so much CO2 to the atmosphere. Of course, we're not the only country that produces lots of CO2, but we are one of them, and we should recognize this and take responsibility for the consequences of climate change on people in other countries. Climate change, as you say, is also affecting people within the United States. So just as the whole climate system changes in that dry corridor in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and forces farmers to flee, we are now seeing in Iowa, we're seeing high variations in corn productivity and overall declines in corn productivity, while up in northern Alberta,
Canada,
they are seeing, up in Canada, they are seeing steady rises in corn production, and they are converting from winter wheat and things like this to corn production. So it won't be long before they are out competing our farmers in the United States. Some of the farmers know this already, but generally nobody else does. So yeah, climate change is affecting us. Sea level rise is already affecting real estate values in places like Miami, which has a lot of low-lying coastal property, property that used to be the most valuable. In 2017, there was a Wall Street Journal article that pointed out that those real estate values right on the coast had already declined at that point by 7%. So projections for how those people will be moving suggest that millions and millions will be fleeing the coastline. And there's even some studies that suggest where those people will end up. And some of them are projected to end up in Arizona and in Coconino County in Arizona, and many in Colorado. And there was a very good study done by some professors at University of California, Berkeley. And there was a National Geographic article that illustrated this. And they show for all of the coastal counties around the United States, how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions will be fleeing from each of those counties as sea level rises.
This winter, also, we don't have much snow. There is no snow right now. And if we have snow, they projected to have snow only 20%, and very little, maybe a couple of inches. And compared to 10, 50 years ago, when I arrived to Colorado, it came up to a foot. So the change is rapid. It's coming very, very rapid. And we also have wildfires in the Colorado Rockies, a national park. This was the most destructive fire we have in a long time, everybody say. The same in California, fires all over, droughts. It affects also the food production, like you mentioned, right? Yeah. So the people still don't notice because this is a very logistical country that there is always food in every small town in the US for a long period of time. Very logistical. We are all connected in this country. But for example, yesterday was watching a video, the one that you suggested, refugees, climate change refugees. It's a movie. It's a documental. They touched the subject of Bangladesh. Bangladesh, it's a very poor country that sometimes there is a 3-day supply of food. They don't have the logistic like here. Only 3 days supplies of food. So if there is a catastrophe coming, a natural disaster coming, it will block for hundreds of millions of people access to food. And that strikes me because these people already are malnutrition. They live in a different environment, a lot of toxic in the water. They don't have the condition that the Western hemisphere we have. Also, they mention about 4 rivers that come from Nepal and the Himalayas, that all the billions of people just depend on the water of those 5 rivers. Can you imagine if something going on there?
Well, so you've touched on a number of subjects there. So let me start with the first one. So yes, you guys are experiencing less snow in the Rockies, and it affects us here in Arizona because that snow in the mountains is the source of the Colorado River.
Yes.
And of course, because the snow is declining, the flow of the Colorado River is declining, and the people in Las Vegas, the people in Phoenix, in Tucson, in much of Southern California depend on that water source. And then, of course, the people in Mexico, they always have gotten sort of what's left over, and there is less and less left over as the Colorado flows less and less. So this reduction in snowfall in Colorado affects tens of millions of people. And so we also have a ski mountain here in Flagstaff, and we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing less snow, but also the warmer temperatures. So what little snow we get does not last as long.
Yeah.
In any case, this is affecting people around the world. You mentioned people in Bangladesh. Yes, in the United States and countries like the United States, we have a very steady food supply, and people get disconnected. They think of their food comes from the grocery store,
Yeah.
right? They don't think so much anymore that the food comes from healthy agricultural fields and the weather that allows crops to ripen and be harvested. But the reality of that, I think, hit us a little bit during COVID when suddenly the supplies of certain things were no longer there. I think that's the first time in many generations that people in the United States realized that they depend on a supply.
Yes. Yes.
So I don't know if they will be able to translate this thinking to, well, what happens if climate change changes the farmer's situation? But hopefully they can make that connection and begin to realize how important it is for us to reduce our carbon footprint. Because we depend on nature, we depend on climate, we depend on productive agricultural ecosystems.